We've been very lucky. We hadn't had many illnesses in the family for a very long time. My grandparents lived to the high 90s.
The palace never speaks unless it must, and this time it spoke in whispers. What followed, no one was ready for. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because once you hear the truth behind this morning's announcement, you'll understand why the world may never look at the monarchy the same way again. It started with 12 words that froze an entire nation. A brief, sterile message from Buckingham Palace that landed just before dawn. An important statement will be released at 6 a.m. That was it. No reason, no reassurance, just those words. And in the silence that followed, millions felt something shift, like the ground beneath their feet had moved an inch closer to history. Phones lit up in dark bedrooms. Curtains fluttered in cold London air as early risers stared at glowing screens. Outside Windsor, the fog hung thick and unbroken, clinging to the palace walls like a ghost refusing to leave. It was the kind of silence that carried a heartbeat, waiting, trembling, holding something too heavy for words. Reporters whispered into microphones. Helicopters circled at a respectful distance, their spotlights dimmed as though even machines knew to lower their tone. And somewhere behind those ancient stone walls, footsteps echoed, calm, deliberate, inevitable. Prince William arrived just after 5, no flashing lights. No escort, no ceremony, only purpose. His car stopped before the gates, and as he stepped out, cameras zoomed in. He looked composed, but his eyes betrayed him. They weren't the eyes of a prince. They were the eyes of a son walking into the unknown. For years, Britain had seen him as the symbol of stability, the steady hand, the quiet strength, the future of the crown. But this morning, he wasn't the future. He was the bridge between two worlds. One fading, one not yet ready to begin. The guards saluted as he entered, their faces pale under the flickering lights. Somewhere deep inside the palace, a clock chimed the hour, 6 slow tolls, and the nation held its breath. Every monarchy is built on ritual. There's a rhythm to the crown, an order to its chaos. But on that cold October morning, the rhythm faltered. The corridors that once echoed with the confidence of power now carried only whispers. Aides spoke in fragments. Papers rustled, phones buzzed, and behind every closed door, uncertainty bloomed like fog. William climbed the grand staircase, his footsteps swallowed by the red carpet that had seen centuries of triumph and tragedy. At the landing, a familiar portrait caught his eye. His grandmother, regal, unflinching, immortal in oil and gold. For a moment, he stopped. He remembered her steadiness, the weight she carried, and the impossible grace with which she bore it. And he thought, maybe this is what she meant when she said, "The crown never truly waits. It watches." Inside the king's study, a single lamp glowed. Papers were stacked neatly beside the red box, the same one every monarch receives. A vessel of duty, sealed in silence. The air smelled faintly of old books, and the kind of sadness that never fully leaves. The door creaked. William stepped in. There are moments in life that split time, before and after. Peace and truth. What he saw next became one of those moments. His father sat by the window, wrapped in a blanket, the morning light pooling around him like faded gold. The king looked out at the gardens, where the first frost sparkled on the grass. His hand trembled slightly, the veins pronounced, the years visible. But his eyes were clear. History doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it looks like a father turning to his son and saying quietly, "It's time." Outside, the world was already guessing. Social media flooded with speculation, hashtags rising like waves. Wadinan royal silence, Madinan Windsor watch, Madinan pray for the king. News presenters adjusted their tones. Voices softer now, as though speaking too loudly might tip the balance of fate. Crowds gathered at the palace gates, wrapped in coats, holding phones, flowers, flags. They didn't know what they were waiting for, only that something irreversible was about to happen. As hours stretched into eternity, small details began to leak. The king had been unwell. Meetings had been postponed. There were talks of a temporary transfer of duties, a word no one dared say aloud. Regency. Yet, it wasn't just about protocol. It was about people, a family bound by duty, but defined by love. Inside, William stayed close. Aides moved quietly, courtiers hovering like shadows in the periphery. Every breath, every glance carried meaning. There was the exchange of documents, the soft murmur of voices, The clicking of a pen signing something that felt heavier than ink could justify. William's hand paused for a moment over the paper. The red box gleamed beside him. Duty was no longer an idea. It was alive. Outside Windsor, time warped. Strangers spoke to one another like old friends. A woman whispered to her son about the boy who once walked behind his mother's coffin. He was just a child, she said. Now he's the man holding us together. Her words trembled in the wind and vanished into the grey sky. That evening, the rain began. Slow, steady, unrelenting. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, their voices breaking through static. The palace remained silent. No updates, no clarifications. Just a statement promised. In due course. The tension felt almost sacred, like the pause before a church bell tolls. Inside the palace, Catherine sat alone by the fire. Her face was calm, but her eyes flickered with thoughts too heavy to speak. She had always understood the difference between privacy and secrecy, but this was something else. This was the heart of a family, and the weight of a nation colliding. When William finally joined her, he didn't have to say a word. She already knew. He simply sat beside her, their hands touching for a moment that said everything. By midnight, the storm outside had grown fierce. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the Windsor towers like silent watchmen. Somewhere deep in the palace, the lights dimmed and steadied. The king slept. William remained awake. He wandered through the halls of his childhood, rooms that had once echoed with laughter, now filled with the quiet hum of destiny. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch him, generations of monarchs frozen in stoic poses. He thought of his mother, of how she'd walked through these same corridors with grace and defiance, how her legacy followed him not as a shadow, but as a light he could never outrun. He stopped by the balcony overlooking the courtyard. The rain had turned to mist, swirling under the lamps. He could see the crowd still waiting, their umbrellas forming a patchwork of patience. They didn't demand answers. They just stood there, loyal, silent, hearts beating in unison with his own. And in that strange, suspended moment, he understood something few ever do. That leadership isn't born in coronations or ceremonies. It's born in nights like this, when the world is watching and you have no script, no certainty, only the fragile courage to keep standing. As dawn crept closer, a gentle knock echoed through the corridor. A young aide entered, holding a document in trembling hands. "They're ready for the statement, sir," William nodded. His voice, when he finally spoke, was steady. "Then let's make it right." He returned to his father's study. The first light of morning painted the room in gold and grey. The king stirred, eyes opening, and for a moment, father and son simply looked at each other. No crown, no title, just two men connected by blood and duty. Charles reached for the red box, his hand shaking slightly. He slid it across the desk toward William. "It's yours for now." The words were quiet, but they hit like thunder. William didn't move at first. His throat tightened. There were no cameras, no courtiers, no ceremony, only that simple exchange, soaked in history and heartbreak. Finally, he placed his hand on the box, fingers brushing against the worn leather. Outside, the palace clock struck 6. News anchors straightened their papers. Crowds pressed closer to the gates. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the palace gates opened, and an envelope was delivered to the waiting press. Cameras clicked, microphones lifted, and within seconds, the statement appeared across every screen. The king has entered a period of rest, following medical advice. The Prince of Wales will undertake constitutional duties on His Majesty's behalf. There it was, the truth dressed in formality. But beneath the polished words lay the unspoken message the world understood instantly. The torch had been passed. Across the country, people stopped what they were doing. In pubs, shops, train stations, everything paused. There were no tears yet, no hysteria, only a profound, collective stillness, as if an entire nation was whispering the same prayer. At Windsor, William stepped outside. The air was cold, the sky a wash of pale blue breaking through grey. Cameras flashed, but he didn't flinch. He simply looked out at the waiting crowd, his expression unreadable, his composure absolute. Behind him, the Union Jack fluttered at half-mast. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, not mournfully, but with a slow, deliberate grace, marking not an end, but a transition. The prince turned his head slightly toward the sound, eyes glistening, then looked back toward the palace. The weight of history settled quietly on his shoulders. For a moment, the world saw not a prince, not even a future king, but a man standing alone between yesterday and tomorrow. And as the cameras kept rolling, capturing the quiet resolve in his face, a single line echoed through living rooms, newsrooms, and the hearts of millions watching. It wasn't a coronation. It wasn't an abdication. It was the quiet passing of power, from one trembling hand to another. The wind carried the sound of bells through the crowd. Somewhere, a child asked her mother why everyone was so quiet. And as dawn spread across the kingdom, one truth settled in the air like morning mist. That sometimes, the loudest moments in history are the ones spoken in silence, because on that morning, Britain didn't lose its king. It found its heart. The first light of dawn slid across the London skyline like a quiet promise. It touched the tops of buildings, the edges of the Thames, and finally the gates of Buckingham Palace, where a single guard shifted his stance and blinked against the rising sun. The statement had been out for only a few hours, but its weight already filled the air. The world had changed overnight. By sunrise, one man carried the heartbeat of a nation and the shadow of a crown. News outlets across continents repeated his name, their tones a blend of admiration and disbelief. In Times Square, a screen flashed his image beside the words, "Prince William steps forward." In Sydney, commuters watched the broadcast in silence, coffee cups trembling slightly in their hands. From Cape Town to Calgary, the same photographs looped endlessly. William standing outside Windsor, shoulders squared, eyes calm, yet impossibly tired. It wasn't just news. It was history unfolding in real time. Outside the palace, people began to gather, ordinary citizens carrying extraordinary grief. Bouquets pressed against iron gates, candles flickered in cups, their flames dancing in the breeze. A handwritten sign leaned against the wall. "We stand with you, William." It was a vigil without speeches, without leaders, without plan, a spontaneous pulse of unity. The crowd swelled through the morning, voices low, eyes red. Some prayed. Some simply stared at the palace windows, waiting for a curtain to move. The hush felt sacred, as if the entire kingdom had agreed to breathe together. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes through bloodlines. 27 years earlier, the world had watched a boy walk behind a coffin, his face pale, his grief too heavy for childhood. Now that same boy stood at the head of a nation, holding back the same storm. The symmetry was heartbreaking. The boy who once mourned beside his brother now carried the burden of both father and country. Cameras tried to capture it, the poise, the restraint, but what they really caught was the humanity. Beneath the tailored coat and ceremonial duty was a son, holding his composure with trembling fingers. The headlines called him Britain's beating heart. The phrase stuck, because somehow, in the midst of constitutional procedure and centuries-old tradition, the story had become deeply, painfully human. Clips from old interviews resurfaced. William speaking of compassion, of service, of his mother's influence. The one line that echoed most: "Leadership begins with empathy." That quote spread faster than the statement itself. People reposted it, painted it on banners, whispered it like a mantra. This wasn't royal gossip anymore. It was a global vigil. The image of the monarchy shifted overnight from diamond crowns to tear-streaked humanity. The Prince of Wales had become something Britain hadn't seen in generations, a royal who looked like one of them. Inside Windsor, the days blurred. Meetings began before dawn and ended past midnight. William read briefings, signed papers, fielded calls, and still found time to sit quietly by his father's side. The king slept often now. Doctors came and went in near silence. He wasn't ruling. He was holding the line between duty and grief. Camilla moved through the corridors with soft authority, speaking to staff, keeping order where chaos threatened to bloom. Her calm steadied the palace, but it was William's endurance that defined it. Every knock on his door carried responsibility. Parliamentary updates, military briefings, letters from foreign leaders, and he faced each one with measured calm. Sleep came in fragments. He'd close his eyes for an hour, sometimes two, and wake to the rustle of papers. The crown might not yet rest on his head, but its weight pressed against his shoulders. Behind closed doors, the monarchy was already functioning as if the crown had shifted. The king's red box now sat on William's desk. His handwriting filled the margins of state papers. Courtiers began to address him differently, not as Your Royal Highness, but with the subtle deference reserved for a sovereign in waiting. Sometimes the crown changes heads without ceremony, only silence. Every act, every signature, every public word was a rehearsal for permanence. Yet the word temporary remained carefully written into every announcement, a fragile promise that time might still turn backward. The nation clung to it, even as reality whispered otherwise. In living rooms and pubs, people debated what came next. Would there be a regency? Would the king recover? Was William already leading in all but name? Britain wasn't waiting for a new king. It was watching one already lead. For William, the hardest moments were the quiet ones. Late nights in the crimson drawing room, the fire dying low, his reflection wavering in the window. Sometimes he'd press his hands together, elbows on his knees, eyes closed. "That's not a bridge I'm ready to cross," he had said to a confidant days earlier. Yet here he was, standing at the edge of it. Even future kings can fear the future. He thought of his children sleeping in the nursery, of the world they would inherit. He thought of Catherine, who carried her strength like armor, elegant, unbreakable, endlessly supportive. And he thought of his father, whose life had been defined by waiting, only to find that the throne offered no peace, only endurance. Sunday morning arrived, wrapped in stillness. A new statement from the palace read simply, "His Majesty continues to rest comfortably. The Prince of Wales will maintain his schedule of duties." The words felt cautious, almost tender. They didn't announce hope or despair, just a holding pattern of grace. Outside, autumn sunlight spilled over Windsor Gardens. The leaves had turned gold, shimmering like memory. William stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the wind scatter petals across the path. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe. Leadership isn't about crowns or speeches. It's about how you stand when silence is all you have. In that silence, he found clarity. The monarchy wasn't a building or a title. It was a thread of continuity, woven through centuries of uncertainty. And right now, that thread ran through him. He turned back toward his desk, the same desk where his father had once signed his name with unwavering confidence. Now it was his turn. The papers before him were simple but symbolic. Letters of acknowledgement, approvals, duties once reserved for the king. He picked up the pen, paused, and wrote carefully. William Piatt looked strange. Yet right. Outside, church bells began to ring across the countryside. Their sound rolled through the air like distant thunder, softened by faith. Crowds at the gates bowed their heads. Some crossed themselves. Some whispered thank yous. And though no official proclamation had been made, everyone understood. Something had shifted again. The throne was still occupied, but the heart of the kingdom had already moved forward. Inside the palace, a small gesture went unnoticed by the cameras. William placed his father's signet ring, removed for safekeeping during his rest, on the red box beside the royal seal. He stood for a long time, staring at it. The gold glinted faintly in the morning light, a quiet circle of promise. For once, the crown didn't divide. It made people feel. Across Britain, an unexpected tenderness spread. Political tensions softened. Newspaper columns spoke of unity instead of scandal. Strangers greeted one another kindly on trains. It was as if the nation had remembered its capacity for empathy through the example of one man who carried his grief with dignity. At night, families lit candles by windows. Children drew pictures of the palace, of hearts, of crowns shining beside stars. Their innocence stitched hope back into a weary kingdom. The lesson was simple, but profound. The monarchy's power didn't lie in its wealth or heritage. It lay in its humanity. William knew it too. He could feel it in the letters arriving daily, thousands of them. Messages from veterans, nurses, school children. One read, "You don't have to be king to make us proud." Another, "Your mother would be smiling." He kept them in a drawer, unopened now, because their presence alone was enough. He spent that evening walking the palace grounds. The air was cool, scented with rain and earth. The horizon glowed faintly pink where the sun had set behind the towers. He paused by the small lake, the surface still except for a few ripples from swans gliding past. The reflection of Windsor Castle shimmered upside down, solid above, fragile below. Maybe that was what legacy really was. Not the stone or the ceremony, but the reflection. The part that lived on in the hearts of those who watched, believed, remembered. Back inside, the palace lights began to flicker on one by one, windows glowing like constellations. Staff moved quietly through corridors, their voices hushed. Somewhere, a radio played a string arrangement of God Save the King, slower, more tender than ever before. History may be written by kings, but it's remembered by the hearts that endure them. As midnight neared, William stood again at the same window where his father had once looked out upon the kingdom. The city beyond shimmered under rain-soft light. He could see his own reflection faintly overlaying the skyline, a silhouette half shadow, half flame. He thought of everything ahead, the council meetings, the oaths, the ceremonies waiting patiently on the horizon. But for the first time, they didn't frighten him. They humbled him. Because the true measure of a king wasn't how he carried the crown, but how he carried the people who believed in it. In the courtyard below, a small group still kept vigil, their candles tiny stars against the darkness. One woman began to hum, a tune almost lost to the wind. Others joined softly until the air filled with a gentle harmony, fragile but unbroken. The melody drifted upward, reaching the window where William stood. He closed his eyes and listened. Maybe the real power of a king is knowing when to be human. He turned from the window, the glow of candlelight reflected in his eyes. The night outside deepened, but the lights within the palace stayed on, steady, golden, unyielding. A symbol not of grandeur, but of continuity, of a family still standing, of a nation still breathing, and in that quiet, eternal space between what was and what will be, the story of Britain found its pulse again, steady, resolute, alive. Because some chapters end not with fanfare, but with faith. And this one ended with a prince who never asked for the crown, yet became its beating heart.